All right. Every time I do this video, I end up having a long pause at the beginning while I'm waiting for people to come on. But I think today that I'm just going to get started, and people who come in later can rewind or watch the video later. So the first thing I want to do is turn off my ringer, because I know people are going to be trying to interrupt me while I'm doing this video, because that's really how it goes, right? There we go. Okay, so let's get started talking about March. Um, I think some of the big picture overview stuff is that planets are moving through Pisces. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the sign Pisces. And then Jupiter stations retrograde next week. I'm going to spend some time talking about that. And Mercury is retrograde in Pisces this year, and I really have some interesting things to share about that this year, this month. And other than that, I think that's the big picture stuff. I'm looking down at my phone because on here I have all of the major astrological events each day and each week. So that means new and full moons, planetary sign changes, retrograde stations, planets entering their retrograde shadow, and things like that. Because this is what I look at to help me stay on top of stuff. So if you have the People's Oracle 2018 Sidereal Astrology Guide, most of what's in my calendar on my phone is actually in that calendar, but I do have like aspects that I felt would be too much for that calendar. So let's talk. And I don't have my tissue with me, so I might have to pause to get some tissue. Matter of fact, let me do that. I'm gonna be right back. If you don't see me, it's because I got tissue. Be right back. All right. So I'm back. Good. That gives some people some time to come on. I see a few people have come on. All right. So let's talk about March. Today is the first day of March, and I feel like this month really starts off with a lot of energy because uh, there's a full moon in Leo today, and tomorrow planets start their way shuffling through Pisces. So today, I've talked about the full moon extensively on Twitter in a thread, so I won't waste time rehashing that here, other than to say that, since 2015, we've had eclipses in Aquarius and Leo, sidereal Aquarius and Leo. And today is a full moon in Leo, and it's not an eclipse. And actually, earlier in February was the last eclipse in that sign pair. And so this one may feel like it's drudging up some of that energy just because it is 6 months after a pretty potent solar eclipse in Leo that we had last August 2017. So today's full moon is a culmination of those things, but not a culmination in a really dramatic way, in the way that eclipses usually bring. From now on, we are having eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn, which started in February of 2017. So we'll continue that this year, while we're also having our first eclipse in the Gemini Sagittarius sign pair this summer. So things are moving swiftly, and this story is transitioning to the next set of signs. So let's move on to talking about the sign Pisces. In February, we had the Sun, Mercury, and Venus all transiting through sidereal Aquarius, and now they get the opportunity to go through Pisces. So I want you all to think back to the beginning of last year, from January till about May of 2017. And Venus was actually in Pisces that entire time. It entered Pisces the end of January and stayed until like the beginning of May. And Venus was retrograde in Pisces. And so this month, Lord help us, we get a little bit of a resurgence of that energy revisiting and moving forward with some of the energy stories and the house and part of your chart where Pisces is. So let's talk about Pisces. Pisces is a water sign, and it is the home of Jupiter. And I always have to say that because a lot of modern astrological doctrine says that Neptune is the ruler of Pisces, but outer planets cannot rule or govern. To rule a sign means it has command of, and any planets in a particular sign will answer to that planet. So Jupiter has authority over and command of Pisces, and anytime there are planets in Pisces, those planets are answering to Jupiter. So, Pisces is a water sign. It's a mutable water sign, the home of Jupiter, as I was saying. But what does all of that really mean? Part of it means that when we're talking about a planet like Jupiter that's both warm and moist, this is fertile, right? The womb is warm and moist. The earth is warm and moist as roots dig deep and grasp onto it in order to grow. So Pisces is a fertile sign, and that has some literal and figurative connotations. Fertile as in if you have your moon in Pisces, or the ruler of your fifth house in Pisces, or your fifth house is Pisces, and then that can mean that you are in fact fertile in the biological sense. But fertile can also mean full of potential, full of ideas, full of the things that are necessary to make things grow, or full of the things that are required for something um, to be planted, right? So Pisces is that sign. But ultimately, Pisces teaches us about the desire that we all have to connect to something larger than ourselves. This need that we have in varying degrees in each of us to escape the individual emotional experience that we have within our physical bodies, and to get outside of that, to transcend, which means to kind of rise above or even transmute our own emotional experience into something bigger, into something larger, which can be art, can also be religion. So anytime you have planets in Pisces, that means that they are subservient to the need to connect to something larger than oneself. It means that they are under the command of a planet that allows us to do that in many different ways. So say you have your moon in Pisces, then that means that your physical body, your home, your upbringing, your mother, all of those things allow you to transcend your own body, your own emotional experience. That can mean something as simple as being adopted, right? I have moon in Pisces and I was adopted. Not everyone who has moon in Pisces is adopted. Obviously, that's unique to each individual chart. But all of that to say that for me, family means to connect to something larger than myself. It means to transcend my biological ties and connect to something bigger, which is what adoption allowed me to do. And I know a few other people who have that placement who've had a similar kind of experience there. So this month, we begin with both Mercury and Venus entering Pisces on March 2nd. That's actually tomorrow on Friday. And so these two planets will begin working for Jupiter. They will begin being under the command that requires us to connect to something larger than ourselves. So when we're talking about Mercury, and this is really fascinating to me because Mercury and Venus have kind of this tense relationship as it comes to Pisces, because Venus is exalted in Pisces and Mercury is in detriment and fall in Pisces. So I want to talk about what that means, right? So command, authority, which is rulership, is one kind of dignity, excuse me, and Jupiter has command of Pisces. Another kind of dignity is exaltation, and that means that Venus is not in command of Pisces, but when it's in Pisces, it is an honored special guest of Jupiter. And so it means that what Venus naturally wants to do is supported by being in Pisces. It means that Venus wants us to connect to other people. Venus wants us to transcend our own individual will in order to create bonds and connect with other people. Excuse me. And so Venus is exalted in Pisces that way. And exaltation, what that means is that you take the essence of a planet and you cultivate it and you make it into something more than what it was. And so for Venus, relationships are not just a way to feel like we belong. Relationships are not just a way to feel comfortable or convenient. I mean, we're social creatures, right? Art and music is not just expression for the sake of aesthetics, right? Just for the sake of it looks good, it sounds good, it makes me feel good. Instead, a Venus exalted in Pisces says that art, relationships, all of these things allow us to connect to something larger than ourselves. And so this really is the placement of emotional intimacy. But this is not emotional intimacy that's the high of necessarily being in love and all of the things that that brings. This is the kind of intimacy that merges wills. It says that I am transcending my individual will, my individual autonomy, and this other person or people are transcending their individual will and their autonomy in order to merge and connect, in order to further some larger purpose, in order to push something beyond the limits of what it could be before we came together, right? And so love has this, art has this, music. I mean, you go to a concert and you're all collectively there transcending your individual emotional experiences. You are tuned into the artist, the sounds, the music, all of the aesthetics. And this is something that carries you outside of your body and you feel like you're at one. You feel like you're connecting with something bigger than yourself. That's the power of art and music when it's collective, right? And so religion and spiritual experiences have that as well. When you're in church and the Holy Ghost moves, right? This is because we're all tapped into something larger than ourselves, and it allows us to transcend our individual experience. It allows us to rise above and get outside of what may feel like a prison sometimes, right? Our own emotional experience can feel like a prison because we may feel we're the only one that feels that way. We may feel like we don't, that it isolates us, right? Because we're having this experience. When in fact, Venus and Pisces teaches us, guess what? You know, your emotional experience is not really unique, right? It is something that binds you and connects you to other people. Now let's talk about Mercury. Mercury is in fall or detriment, actually both in Pisces. And so this is kind of the opposite, I would say, of exaltation, because exaltation cultivates and makes something more. It kind of evolves the planet into being something more refined, right? Detriment and fall is the opposite of that. It is a planet in a foreign land. Now, this doesn't mean something negative all of the time. A planet being in its fall or its detriment does not mean that you're doomed. It does not mean that there's something wrong with you or the planet in your chart or the planet that's transiting. What it means is that a planet is inside of a sign under the command and authority of a planet that is not supportive of its agenda. In some cases, it means that it has an opposing agenda. And so that planet, Mercury in this case, has a really hard time doing what it wants to do. Again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. You withhold judgment, right? Because anytime we have a planet somewhere other than its home, it requires adjustment. It requires that that planet be creative and clever in some way. So with Mercury in Pisces, this need to connect to something larger than oneself, which is what Jupiter, who has command of Pisces, represents. Mercury wants to pin down the details. Mercury is literal. What you see is what you get. I have a book. I have the word book, right? And the word book is a stand in for the object book. Nothing deep there, right? But when Mercury is in Pisces, that need to connect to something larger, trying to fit that in the concrete, literal framework of numbers or math, language, or symbols that have really literal meanings is difficult. And so Mercury in Pisces is this transit or placement that wants us to use our words and language to connect to something larger than ourselves. Now, again, this is not necessarily something bad. This could just be that someone has to learn how to fit into the confines of a word or language something bigger, right? This is where we get poetry, right? This is where sometimes we can have confusion in the way that we communicate with each other because the words that we say cannot always fully encapsulate the meaning that we intend to communicate. And so, as we go through this Mercury and Pisces transit, where Mercury will be retrograde, we're really thinking about how do I encapsulate into language, into my communication, into the work of my hands, which I like to think of Mercury. How do we communicate that in a way that encapsulates this need to connect to something larger? Now, Friday, March 2nd, Mercury and Venus both change signs. So Venus dives into its exaltation, and Mercury, I guess, would sink into its detriment, right? Because it's so overwhelmed by the water of Pisces. Mercury and Venus are going to conjunct a few times, actually. So let me get these dates for you. They both enter Pisces tomorrow, March 2nd, but they're going to conjunct twice. The first time is at 1 degree Pisces on on Sunday, March 4th. And these are Eastern time. Actually, yeah, these are Eastern time transits, I believe. Midwest or Eastern, I don't know, Central or Eastern time. So if you're on the other side of the world, it may in fact be Monday, just depending. If you're in like New Zealand or Tokyo or London, maybe even, it might be Monday. But in any case, Mercury and Mars are conjoining. A conjunction is when two planets must combine their significations and meanings, they must combine their tasks, and they both are answering to the same planet, right? So Venus is love, relationships, pleasure, convenience, comfort, and Mercury is language and words. So this is truly an awesome weekend to experience music, to go to a concert that really lets you just get outside of yourself, to have a concert in your home, put on YouTube, listen to some music, and take this time to escape. You know, coming out of all of these Aquarius planets, Pisces is really a stark contrast because Aquarius is detached, it's aloof, it's trying to rise above and disconnect from that emotional experience. Whereas Pisces wants to be deeply immersed in it. And so we should grant ourselves permission to be deeply immersed into um, this emotional experience. So let's move on. What is coming up next? Okay, next week. Oh, yeah, we're getting lit next week, people. Mars finally leaves Scorpio, Jupiter stations retrograde, and Mercury squares Saturn. So these are all really three heavy things. And I want to start with Mars. Mars has been in Scorpio, I believe, since January. Yeah, since January 16th. Mars has been in Scorpio. So that's been an extra long time. Why? Because Mars is going to station retrograde and be in Capricorn from May to November. And so planets like Venus and Mars begin to move slowly through the zodiac in preparation for that retrograde. Instead of spending about 6 weeks in a sign, it will spend 8 weeks in a sign, or 9 or 10 weeks. But when we come to Capricorn, it's going to spend like 5 or 6 months. So Mars in Scorpio has been in its own sign I've talked extensively about this on Twitter as well, but I do want to talk about the difference between Scorpio and Sagittarius, because when I made the switch to the sidereal zodiac, this is one of the changes that I think was really kind of hard for me to parse. But over time, I figured it out. I think that the difficulty parsing the difference between Scorpio and Sagittarius is because Mars is a hot and dry planet, and Jupiter is a hot planet, although it's moist. And so there is a commonality there. Heat disperses, right? It refines. So if you put metal in fire, it melts it and refines the fire, taking the dross off. But the dryness of Mars versus the moistness of Jupiter really is a contrasting element between these two signs when we're talking about their ruling planets. So Jupiter is uh, the ruler of Sagittarius, or it has command over planets in Sagittarius, and Mars is the ruler of Scorpio and has command over those planets. So let's talk about Scorpio, where we've been since January as far as Mars is concerned. Scorpio is a fixed water sign, even though Mars is a hot and dry sign that has command over it. But just quickly, some keywords for Scorpio are emotional autonomy, emotional boundaries, and limited cares to give. I'm going to be nice today. So we have limited cares to give when Mars is in Scorpio, or we're dealing with Scorpio planets, because emotional energy is conserved for self-preservation and protection of one's self, right? I always say that when we're talking about Scorpio planets or placements, you have a right to feel how you feel, and you don't have to always consider other people. That's really difficult because we tend to think very black and white on that kind of thing, right? Either you're considerate and you're caring and compassionate of other people, or you are callous and coarse and inconsiderate. But I think both have their place, right? There are times when we must preserve ourselves, right? We must uh, uh, satisfy the self preservation and survival instincts that we have, right? Because we're not going to be able to consider other people if we're not here, if we're not in our right mind, if we don't have a strong sense of ourselves, right? So this is Scorpio. Scorpio is somewhat of a contracting energy or focusing and narrowing energy, because it withdraws and it brings back to itself in some ways, right? So Jupiter is different. It expands and lets out from itself. We're talking about moistness. So you'll remember that we were talking about Pisces, the other home of Jupiter, and we were talking about Jupiter being hot and moist, or warm and moist rather, because it's not really hot. The Sun and Mars are hot. But we were talking about Mars being moist. I'm sorry, not Mars, Jupiter being moist, right? So we're back to this energy. And again, that moistness and that warmth is fertileness, right? It is having the appropriate conditions for something to take root, to thrive, and to grow. And so this is Sagittarius. Mars is very much about erecting boundaries, emotional boundaries. And again, Jupiter is about transcending them, going beyond what we believe is possible, stepping outside the limitations of our own self-preservation instinct in order to find meaning, to connect our experiences together and make sense of them. This is Sagittarius. And so when we get to having Mars in Sagittarius, Mars is answering to that drive to make sense of our personal experiences and to expand beyond what we thought was possible. Anytime a planet is not in its own sign, it must first consider the agenda of the planet it is under the command of. Mars in Sagittarius is not in its own sign. It's called peregrine because it has no essential dignity like authority or rulership, domicile. Those are all the same thing. It's not exalted, but it also is not debilitated. It's not in fall or detriment. It's peregrine. So it's kind of like out in the wild, like, man, Mars is the planet of war, right? Asserting our own agenda, personal, emotional autonomy, and self-preservation. And it's in Jupiter land. And Jupiter is like, let us do all the things and see all of the people and connect to all of the people and be with all of the people. And Mars is like, yeah. So how do we do that, right? So how do we do that, right? Before we go after what we want, before we become aware of our personal boundaries and establishing them, before we are preserving ourselves and our autonomy, we must consider Jupiter. Does this thing that I am seeking to establish out in the world as a representation of myself, does this thing allow me to go beyond the limits of what I've always thought was possible? Mars in Sagittarius also must answer to our personal convictions, right? This is saying that my autonomy is subservient to my convictions. It's more important for me to tap into my beliefs, to know what I believe is right and true and discover that. It's more important to do that than it is to establish boundaries and be my own person. So this is a really big change. And Mars in Sagittarius is inching toward a conjunction with Saturn. I don't know if you noticed, but generally when Mars is getting ready to go retrograde at some point, it is going to conjoin Saturn. So back in 2016, Mars and Saturn in Scorpio did a dance as Mars retrograded through Scorpio. And before that, I believe in 2014, it was Mars and Mars and Saturn in Libra danced their dance before Mars went retrograde in Libra. So now that's happening, and this conjunction perfects on April 2nd. So all month, Mars will be inching towards Saturn and Sagittarius and getting closer to that planet. I'll talk about that when we get to it because we don't have time. Let's move on to Jupiter. And there's something I want to check in my ephemeris for a second because Jupiter is stationing retrograde on March 8th. Is that right? I don't want to give y'all the wrong dates. Yes, on March 8th. What I am looking for is to see when we get to that degree. Is it there now? Yes. As of today, Jupiter is at the degree where it will station retrograde on March 8th, and that is 29 degrees of Jupiter, 29 degrees of Libra. So let's see. Jupiter will remain at 29 degrees of Libra until March 17th. Goodness gracious. And it really won't move much or get to moving too much before it goes direct at 19 degrees of Libra on July 10th. All right, so Jupiter retrogrades are not as, I would say, important or visceral as, say, a Mercury retrograde, a Mars retrograde, or a Venus retrograde. Jupiter, in the traditional sense, is an outer planet. It takes 12 years to go through the entire zodiac, whereas the planet next to it, Mars, takes like 6 weeks when it's moving at its average speed. So this is a huge difference, right? We call that an outer planet in the traditional sense. So we talked about Jupiter a lot, right? So it seems that Jupiter is a big player this month and that we are paying close attention to what Jupiter is doing, because by the time we get to March 14th until March 25th, the Sun, Mercury, Venus will all be in Pisces, one Jupiter ruled sign, and Mars and Saturn will all be in Jupiter ruled sign Sagittarius. So the 5 planets will all be in Jupiter ruled signs. So we got to know, what is Jupiter doing and how is it taking command over the sky and our lives? I'm glad you asked. Jupiter has been so much of the rave, at least in my own speaking about the themes that have dominated the end of 2017 and most of 2018. Jupiter in Libra and Saturn in Sagittarius have this really fascinating relationship of mixed reception. Jupiter is in the sign of Saturn's exaltation, right? Saturn is exalted in Libra, and earlier in the video I talked about what exaltation means. And then Saturn is in the home of Jupiter, so Saturn is under the command of Jupiter. But once we get to about the 14th of March, all of the planets, man, every single planet will be in a Jupiter-ruled sign. Man, that's so heavy. It's just really hitting me right now. So let's talk about that a little bit. Jupiter in Libra is subservient to Venus. So our personal convictions, our moral values, our need to connect to something larger than ourselves, and our drive to make sense of our personal experiences all are subservient to our need to connect to others, to belong, to be accepted, to be liked, to love, to be comfortable, to function in a manner of convenience, but also to be beautiful and experience joy and pleasure. So Jupiter is answering to all of those things. And in general, this transit makes it easier for people to come together, because we're looking for where our personal convictions are congruent with others. We're looking for our tribe, in a sense, our tribe in the sense of our convictions and what we believe to be right and true. So we've seen this happen, right? We've seen women coming together, and that makes sense because Venus rules women. So why wouldn't women be coming together? Why wouldn't women be taking the charge and taking the lead really in every movement, right? We're watching the youth rise up around the country, and there is a major woman who is taking the lead in that, or at least a young woman, a young girl, Emma Gonzalez, right? So we're seeing this all over. We have all of these movements converging because people are doing a Libra thing for the sake of Jupiter. They are coming together and combining their individual wills because they share moral, political, social convictions. All right? So now, when we get through this month, and all of these planets are in Jupiter ruled signs, it means that everything is working together for the good of Jupiter. The sun, right? Significant men, leaders, even our own self concept, and how we see the world as a reflection of us, answering to Jupiter in Libra. Mercury, how we communicate, the language, the stories, the news, all of those things are answering to Jupiter in Libra. Venus, our relationships, and that's really a special relationship. In order for two planets, and this is a caveat, in order for two planets to be in mutual reception, they have to be an aspect to each other. Unfortunately, Pisces and Libra are not an aspect to each other. That means they can't see each other. So it's kind of like Jupiter being in Jupiter being in Venus's home, and Venus is being in Jupiter's home, but they don't know that they're there, right? So it's kind of a missed opportunity, but I still think it's worth noting that this kind of uh, feedback loop is happening in some way, shape, or form. So Venus in Jupiter's home is again answering to Jupiter things, our relationships, all of these things that need to connect to something larger than ourselves, right? Then we have Mars and Saturn, which are in the fiery side of Jupiter, which is Sagittarius. So Mars and Saturn both are leading us back to Jupiter. They are under the command of Jupiter. They are working for our moral convictions, political convictions, blah, blah, blah. I've said all of that. So this is going to be an interesting month, March 14th through the 26th. Jupiter is going to be moving very slow at that time. Generally, because a planet is stationing retrograde, it moves slow in preparation, and then it takes some time in order to get moving again after it appears to have stopped in the sky, which is what a stationary retrograde is. So all of our attention is on Jupiter. We are going to be talking about women. We are going to be talking about women's issues. We're going to be talking about the candidates who are running in primaries all over the country, and we're going to see women winning. They're going to be showing us a preview of November when Venus is retrograde in Libra. So don't miss this opportunity to align yourself with the causes that are important to you. Amplify the work of women, because that's where the trend is, right? I mean, to be frank, companies, businesses, corporations, brands, if you want to be on the cutting edge of what's happening this year, you need to be backing women candidates, whatever your political persuasion is. You need to be supporting brands that are owned by women, and particularly underrepresented gender representations, as well as racial representation. So queer black women, right? Because Libra also is about equality, right? We've seen these laws again and again. DACA, it's going to keep going. The Supreme Court was like, nope, not drawing me into it. You got to keep it just the way it is, right? This is about equality. This is about leveling the playing field in some way, but also giving these underrepresented identities of gender and race an opportunity to put forth their agenda. So we are seeing that coming together in a way where people are like, we share this belief. We share this moral conviction. Despite the differences that we may have, we can come together. Let's move on. I could talk about that all day because you see it's got me hype. All right. Ooh, yes, this is good. March 11th. Mercury is going to square Saturn. Now, this is another major trend that's happening this month because Sun, Mercury, Venus are all going to be in Pisces. At some point, the moon will be as well. And so that means that they are all going to take turns squaring Saturn and Mars. Okay? So last month, planets in Aquarius squared Mars in Scorpio. This month, planets in Sagittarius are going to square, I'm sorry, planets in Venus, gotta rewind. Planets in Pisces are going to square planets in Sagittarius. So that's Sun, Mercury, Venus squaring Mars and Saturn, all taking their turns. March 11th, Mercury is first. And so we can see a little pattern unfolding here that Mercury is taking the charge a little bit because it's going to be the first planet to square Saturn and to square Mars. Is that right? Yeah. And let me make sure I'm not missing anything because when we're talking about Mercury this month, we also have to talk about Mercury retrograde, and I just don't want to miss out on this when it enters its shadow. I missed that. I did. It is March 8th or 9th. Mercury reaches 10 degrees of Pisces, and it will effectively be in its shadow. I'll talk about that again later, though, just in case. Um, so yes, so we're talking about the Pisces Sagittarius square. So instead of breaking down each and every one of these squares between planets in Pisces and Sagittarius, I'm just going to talk about the square in general between the two signs. This is not the worst square, right? We think of the hardest squares between Mars and Saturn ruled signs or Sun and Moon and Saturn ruled signs. Those are really the hardest. Squares between Mars and, I'm sorry, Mercury and Jupiter ruled signs are not the worst. I mean, this theme of lost in translation, right? Not being able to speak the language. Um, or communicate effectively because y'all just speak different languages, that could be a manifestation of Pisces square Sagittarius and planets in both of those signs. But one of the things that I think is the biggest difference between these two signs is that Sagittarius is concerned with truth and being right. It is concerned with personal experience as evidence for truth and wisdom as lived experience. But Pisces is like, yeah, I don't really have to experience it to know it's true. I can transcend my individual emotional experience. I can transcend my own body. I can transcend my own being or the confines of my own consciousness in order to know or experience something without actually having to do it. I mean, this is what empathy is, right? Being able to feel what another person is feeling without actually having the experience that led to that feeling. And Sagittarius is like, yeah, but how do you know it's true? Yeah, but how do you know it's true? It's looking for evidence not in a literal or material sense. That's very Virgo. It's looking for evidence in a fiery sense, which is really about action and experience. And so that's the real disconnect between those two signs. And then we're talking about fire, which is Sagittarius, and water, which is Pisces. So again, these two things are kind of rubbing up against each other. Um, so this square, which begins with Mercury, is really, I don't know. I just want to say it's not the worst. Now, to be fair, dealing with Mercury and Jupiter always brings up some travel stuff. So there could be accidents, but more like, your ticket getting lost or your flight getting canceled or your whole everything just being gone for whatever reason. And because we're dealing with a Mercury retrograde, that's also something that's really possible this month. Um, Now, when it gets to Mars, and Mars is a feature in these squares, excuse me, then that's when things can get difficult because Mars is just messy. It's in a fire sign, and so its more disruptive qualities get amplified. So the conflicts, divisiveness, accidents, violence, all of those things become much more possible once Mars and Sagittarius is a part of the square. So let's move on. I'm just trying to retweet this so people know I'm here. I never intend to make these videos that long, but it is what it is. All right. Where are we? All right. So, yeah. Yeah. So, the 13th Venus square Saturn. Now, that's a tough one for relationships. Now we're talking about Venus. I didn't mean to talk about this. Venus was retrograde in Pisces last year, and Mercury is going to retrace all of those steps for the most part where where Venus was traveling retrograde last year. So let me make sure I'm getting this right. Venus was retrograde from, oh man, was it like 4 degrees Pisces? I think it was 3 degrees Pisces to 19 degrees Pisces. And let me just double check. You know, I like to be accurate. Accurate. Let's see. I'm looking for where Venus. Oh, here we go. Okay, Venus station direct. Oh, it's 2 degrees Pisces. My lord. So Venus and Mercury are revisiting those parts of the zodiac this month. So what was your Venus retrograde in Pisces story last year? What kind of revelations did you have in relationships? What kind of people resurfaced and played with your feelings? Or did you play with their feelings? Right? The hope of making something from whatever it is you guys had before, or going beyond whatever it is that you guys had before. And were you able to materialize it? Saturn was square Venus then. And so Saturn was like, are you sure? Right? Saturn always reminds us that we have limited time, energy, and resources. And so the ideals of our desire bumping up against the reality of what we really believe is possible, the reality of the time and energy that we really have, or the prior commitments that have kept us um, busy, right? Or have used up our time and energy. Uh, this is really what that Venus and Pisces square Saturn was back then, and it's back again. So this aspect will happen every time that Venus is in Pisces while Saturn is in Sagittarius, which is until 2020. Is that right? I think so. Okay, so Mercury, though, will be retrograde in this part of the zodiac. So anytime that we have these events like that, so Pisces was retrograde, Venus was retrograde in Pisces last year between 2 and 19 degrees of Pisces. That has like a little thing dug in it. Even more so because Venus goes retrograde in that exact same part of the zodiac every 8 years. So 8 years prior to 2017, which was what, 2009? Venus was retrograde in Pisces in that same part of the zodiac. And so for some people, the Venus retrograde last year brought up similar people and themes, issues, problems, opportunities that were planted or occurred in the beginning of 2009. So now in 2018, in March, Mercury is going to travel between 10 degrees Pisces and 21 degrees Pisces. So there's a small portion of that retrograde that was revisited now that Mercury is going to be retrograde there. So just thinking about the stories of last year, the little difference between Venus and Mercury is that Venus is like, let me get beyond, reality. Let me connect to something larger. It's not so much concerned with the limitations of reality as much as it's concerned with the possibility of what could be. And so Mercury is now in that same position. It's not concerned with, well, it's forced really to be concerned with the limitations of language and symbols and the work of our hands. But how can we use language, use symbols, use the work of our hands to escape the drudgery and mundaneness of what it is that we are doing? All right. Where are we here? Okay. Sun enters Pisces on March 14th. So I talked about Pisces a lot at the beginning of this video. I won't go back to that. The new moon is at 2 Pisces. All right, see, now that's real juicy because we just talked about Venus stationing direct at 2 degrees Pisces last year. And when was that? Let me give you a date. I like dates because when I give you dates, you be like, Yep, I know exactly what was happening then. So this was April 15th of last year, 2017. Venus station directed to Pisces. And so now we've got a new moon at 2 Pisces. What was your Venus and Pisces story last year? Where is Pisces in your chart? Let me give you a quick rundown. Pisces rising, this is your first house, you, your body, your actions that you take, things that happen to you, or you, things that you do. Aries, this is your 12th house. This is where you go for solitude, to be alone, where you get away from what is familiar, whether that familiarity is the bomb.com and you're mad, or it's off and you're like, thank God. The 12th house is hospitals and institutions. Any solitary work or projects. Taurus, this is your 11th house. So seeking to connect to something larger than yourself via helpful people, via your community, via people who may take an interest and be like, yeah, I got you, boo. Let me help you out. Let me give you some money. Let me give you this connection. Let me connect you with these people. This is all 11th house stuff for you, Taurus, Pisces there. Gemini, Pisces is your 10th house. It is your career and your work. So how was your career, your reputation, and what you were building in that area of life? How is that helping you connect to something larger than yourself? Or how does connecting to something larger than yourself further your reputation? All right, Gemini. After that, we have Cancer. So this is your 9th house. This is all of the gatekeepers, colleges and institutions. I'm sorry, colleges and universities, academic institutions, professors, teachers. These are gatekeepers to knowledge. Governors, but governments is really what I was trying to say. Politicians, these are gatekeepers to power. And we have museums, which are gatekeepers to art. Museums and other venues and mass media are gatekeepers to art and information. And then we have religious institutions. They're gatekeepers to God and spirituality. So these are all the 9th house for you, Cancer. What was going on there? What kind of traveling were you doing? What kind of graduate degree? Realizing that you really don't want to take that path, or that you do want to take that path. All right. Then we are at Leo rising. This is your 8th house. So you see, this is why the 8th house is not an aspect to the first house. Look at this relationship for Leo. Leo is your self-concept, you seeing the world based on how you see yourself. And Pisces is like, yeah, let me get outside of myself. They're really enemies in some way. So this is the 8th house for you, Leo. And the 8th house is death, benefits from death, losses from death, facing your own mortality. You can see by doing Pisces things, Leo is facing its mortality by getting outside the confines of its individual consciousness, awareness, and self-concept. Leo is facing its mortality. So this is 8th house for you. What kind of permanent changes were happening then? Then we get to Virgo. This is your 7th house. This is your lovers, your partners, your spouse, and your open enemies. People you got beef with. You know you got beef with them, and they know you got beef with them too. And so y'all just have it out wide in the open, or you avoid each other. This is a really interesting thing for Virgo too, because the 7th house being opposed the first house is a complement to Virgo. Virgo is literal. Virgo is very much about what you see is what you get, material evidence for what is real and what exists. And again, Pisces is escaping all of those things. So through relationships, Virgo is able to get away from all of that, focusing on the details and nitty gritty and stuff. So Virgo, what's going on there? Who are you partnering with? How are your partnerships allowing you to put the work of your hands to good use? Not just for producing something literal, but for something that has meaning, for something that allows you to really go beyond the limitations of your own self, mentorship and service, right? What kind of partnerships were you having then? Next, we are at Libra. This is your 6th house. 6th house is the roles that you take on in order to be employed, duties and obligations or burdens that you take on. This is your employment or your job description. So what kind of changes were happening there for you during this Venus retrograde back in 2017, Libra? We're almost finished. Let's see. We are at Scorpio. So this is your 5th house, Scorpio. And I always forget to say this. This is for sidereal only. This is not happening in tropical, okay? So if you don't have your sidereal birth chart, you can go to orcle.me/chart guide. I'll be sure to put the link in the description, okay? But for Scorpio, this is your fifth house. So this is sex, pleasure, art, creativity, and all of your progeny, whether these are biological progeny that you produce from your loin, intellectual progeny that you produce from your mind, and progeny that you produce with your hands, your creative works. So what is your creative works that you're working on? How do these works allow you to get outside of yourself? Which, you know, Scorpio, you need that sometimes. I'm just saying. Sagittarius, this is your fourth house. This is your home. This is your family, your parents, your roots, ancestors, land, right? Property. Buying a home, buying your own land, buying your own property. What's going on with your parents and your relationship with them? What's going on with your family? You know, you can see the importance of family for Sagittarius rising, right? But the importance of putting down roots and establishing yourself on firm ground. And what is the ground that you have been rooted and established in? And back in again, really, shoot, man, y'all, Venus was in Pisces from January, so going all the way back to January, all the way through February, March, and April into the beginning of May, or the middle of May, really, I don't know the date. Venus was in Pisces. So what was happening for you then, Sagittarius, regarding your home roots? All of that stuff. We are getting down to the wire now. We are at Capricorn. Capricorn, this is your third house. So this is your family. This is your near kin, near relatives, fictive kin, siblings, cousins, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. This is also you doing something that allows you to kind of sidestep those gatekeepers. You know, the third house is the house of heretics. So this is the house where you're able to access information, access audiences, access power, access God without the need for gatekeepers. So you don't need mass media. You don't need libraries and museums and colleges and universities to validate your work, right? What were you doing with social media and how has that progressed over this time? Okay, these are all ways that you can kind of sidestep those gatekeepers. And what have you been writing, right? This is also the third house. Finally, we're at Aquarius, and Aquarius Pisces is your second house. So again, going back to January through May of 2017, we're back. Mercury and Venus are there, and we've got a new moon right at the degree where Venus stationed direct in April 15 of 2017. So Aquarius, your second house is your earned income. It is your money. It is how you take your skills and resources, whatever it is you got, to turn it into something more than what you need. So taking your skills and turning it into money, taking your money and turning it into possessions, food, whatever it may be. How are you making your money, Aquarius, and what has changed? What have you been working towards? When I give you these signs are meant to be read for your moon, your ascendant first, your moon, and your sun. You can read for all three of those, but for your ascendant, I think is really most accurate. If you were born during the day, meaning before sunrise, after sunrise, before sunset, then your sun can act as an ascendant for you. But if you were born after sunset but before sunrise, you have a nighttime chart and you can use the moon sign in your chart as an ascendant. So me, I've got Pisces moon. So I can use that as a first house or ascendant. So I can read stuff for Pisces rising or Pisces the sign. So remember, this is sidereal, y'all. Don't apply it to your tropical chart because it's just not happening there. All right. Mercury conjoins Venus for the second time at 21 Pisces on March 19th. This is right where Mercury's going to station retrograde. At that time, Mercury's already standing still in the sky. So the first time they conjoined, which is March 4th, Mercury overtakes Venus because it's the quicker moving planet. But as Mercury prepares to station retrograde, Venus is going to overtake Mercury, and then they can join again at 21 Pisces this time. Mercury stations retrograde at 22 Pisces on March 22nd. So we're going back to the 9th of March as when Mercury enters its shadow, stations retrograde on the 22nd. Let's see, March 24th, the Sun in Pisces squares Mars and Sagittarius. This is a rough one. Sun and Mars are, you know, they could be friends sometimes, but more so, they're just an ego trip and figuring out how to do what you want to do and get done what you want to get done without fighting yourself. Venus enters Aries on the 26th of March. So Venus leaves its exaltation and enters the sign of its detriment. So Venus is love, pleasure, come together, be one, conjoin, have fun, make beauty, be friends, be comfortable, create things that allow for convenience, like a chair, right? Because I can sit, I don't have to squat. So that's Venus in Pisces, right? But, or I'm sorry, that's Venus in general. It's general significations. But in Aries, our relationships, all of those things must serve our personal autonomy. Things get a little hairy here, right? Because now Venus is in the sign opposed Libra where Jupiter is. This is a building opposition that perfects in April, on April 17th at 26 Aries and 26 Libra. I'll talk about that then. But I think that I pegged this time, excuse me, where Venus is in Aries as a time where we can really, really, really see some things kicking off with the Time's Up movement, with the Me Too movement, and all of these other equality movements and fairness and justice movements that have kicked off over the past 6 months or so. So, Venus in Aries beginning on the 26th of March is really taking us back to October and November when Venus was in Libra. I believe it was November 12th or 13th when Venus and Jupiter conjoined, and so in Libra, and so now we're moving to that opposition. It's kind of a big deal. It's like a full moon, a culmination of that aspect that was then. Venus, while in that sign, is going to be trine Mars and trine, I don't know, let me not say that. Yeah, I think it trines Mars and Sagittarius. And it will be trine Saturn, and that's all that's important. Okay, Sun squares Saturn on March 29th. Again, this is that same Pisces Sagittarius square that we talked about. And finally, we get our second full moon of the month on March 31st, which is 16 Virgo. I don't really have anything significant to say about that other than the fact that the sky will be very, very, very mutable at that time. I think the only mutable sign that will not be occupied will be Gemini. So if you are have Gemini in your chart, this could really set off some stuff for you just because all four mutable signs will be occupied in your chart. That's kind of a big deal stuff. So, this month is busy. In February, we had like the week of the 19th that was pretty mild, week of the 5th that was pretty mild, but this month, every week is pretty busy. Something is happening, and with the Mercury retrograde really underscoring most of the month, I think that your Pisces house is going to be very, very, very busy. So you can expect me to talk a lot about Pisces on Twitter over the next month. And of course, with the People's Weekly Forecast that I do every week, I post a graphic and start a thread every Sunday outlining the major astrological configurations for the week, sign changes, retrogrades, new and full moons, and aspects and things like that. I post it on Sunday at People's Oracle on Twitter, and I break down in real ways the things that I give an overview of in this forecast. And because some time has passed, we can really look at real life events and things that are occurring and really look for the correlations to the astrology that's happening. So that's that. The only other announcement that I have to make is two. Number one, in my February video, I talked about my webinar on the houses. And due to some family issues, my son was sick this month and in the hospital for a while. I have had to push back that webinar. So now it's on March 18th. And again, you can still register for that. So if you go to thepeoplesoracle.com and click book a reading, you can see on my schedule there a slot for webinars, and you'll be able to book that webinar and be there. If you pay for the webinar in advance, but you are unable to attend, you will have access to a private YouTube video that allows you to view the actual video after the broadcast, which is on March 18th. Second, I've changed my services on my website. So one thing that I've added that people have been begging me to add for a long time, and I finally had the opportunities to do that, is offering Chinese astrology readings. And for the record, this is going to be a little bit different than Western astrology readings. This is really, really, really a pretty precise predictive tool. For those of you who do follow me on Twitter at People's Oracle, you know that Chinese astrology is how I make predictions, political predictions, to see who is going to win races, political races. So I'll be doing a lot of those later this year as we get towards the midterm elections in the United States. But I'm now offering that reading. It's a 1 hour reading and it does require a birth time. So again, if you go to thepeoplesoracle.com and click book a reading, you can order that reading there. And then I've switched some other things around as well as far as my offerings. So check me out. Happy March and happy Pisces. I'm hoping it's happy. We'll see. This is going to be such a huge change from Aquarius, and it starts tomorrow, March 2nd. So thank you guys so much for watching. And yeah, I'll see you next month.